My name is Terry Nye. I'm with Park Pride, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this breakout session, A New Way of Looking at Parks. Before we begin, I'm going to quickly review how to navigate and participate in the discussion. By now, you're familiar with Hopin and how the platform looks, I'm sure. But I just want to remind everyone that if the presentation itself doesn't automatically enlarge, which it should do, you can enlarge it or a single speaker's view by double-clicking on the frame you wish to enlarge. Double-click again on the large frame to take everything back to the gallery view. You can also increase the size of your viewing area by closing the chat area of the window during the presentation. And so you do that by just clicking the little arrow that's marked here on the slide that you see in front of you. Click the arrow icon again to make the chat area reopen if you'd like to use the chat or communicate and use some of the other features. Just make sure that when you are in the chat area that the blue bar is below the word session. This will ensure that your chat comments stay in the session only. You can also use other functions in this area by clicking on the words such as people or Q&A to select them and from one to the other. If you have a question you'd like to ask the speakers, click on Q&A and type your question in the space at the bottom. You can also see a list of questions that other people have already asked and vote them up if you'd like to hear more from that question. We'll be looking at these throughout and we'll pull them together at the end for the Q&A. After the session, you can visit other parts of the conference or go back to the main stage for our final keynote speaker by just clicking on the camera icon on the left-hand side of the screen. If you do have any questions, I'll be monitoring the chat, so if you need any assistance, please type it in the chat box so we'll know that you need some help. If you have a question for the speaker, put that in the Q&A. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. Excuse me. It's my pleasure to bring to you our two speakers today in the breakout. Our first is Diana Fernandez. Diana is a senior associate and landscape architect. She provides critical thought and design leadership for the landscape and planning practice within Sasaki's urban studio. Diana is a proven thinker, collaborator, and leader who teams effortlessly with architects, planners, and the like. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm losing my screen here. Let me close something. So I'm having just a little bit of technical difficulty. There it is. Okie doke. Okay, so Diana, her experience spans a broad range of projects and from planning to built work. She leads and champions better equity and inclusion in planning and built practices from a landscape perspective. Diana holds a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture from Temple University and received multiple awards as a student. More recently, in 2020, the American Society of Landscape Architects awarded Diana the inaugural Emerging Professional Medal. It's truly an honor for us to hear from her today. We're also honored to bring Dr. Deborah Cohen to you today. Dr. Cohen studies how environmental factors influence the health of communities and affect health disparities. Her work has focused on improving the food environment, which currently is designed to promote the overconsumption of nutrient-poor foods. She has also investigated how the management and design of neighborhood parks can support more people to be physically active. She is currently developing and evaluating interventions to promote more physical activity and a healthier diet. Dr. Cohen previously served as a senior physician policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and has served on panels for the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She is the author of A Big Fat Crisis, The Hidden Influences Behind the Obesity Epidemic and How We Can End It, and the co-author of Prescription for a Healthy Nation, A New Approach to Improving Our Lives by Fixing Our Everyday Worlds. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Diana. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for that introduction. It's truly an honor to be here with you all today and to be able to share my work. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 second here. Okay, there you go. Can you all see my screen? Awesome.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm really excited today to talk to you about my work around landscape heterogeneity. And really what I want to do is to be able to sort of show you a new approach to designing landscapes and parks that is really built on this notion of heterogeneity. And if you don't mind just muting yourself, I'm getting a little bit of background noise. Okay, wonderful, thank you. So landscape heterogeneity is really defined by heterogeneity as a term, and it really describes diversity. When we think about biological or ecological systems, we often describe their state or characteristics as having heterogeneous principles. And this is really important because heterogeneity really defines our evolutionary advantage to continue to evolve as a human species. And when I entered the profession of landscape architecture, it was really interesting to me because we always talked a lot about designing a diverse plant palettes for the birds and the bees. And I often found myself asking, well, how are we also designing diverse spaces for people? And this really led me to sort of dialing deeper into landscape heterogeneity, really building upon a lot of the literature that has been written within the landscape ecology group, and really looking at how heterogeneity, both from a compositional and configurational standpoint, can really impact the way in which we look at landscapes and their ability to evolve, to withstand outside forces such as climate change or a pandemic like the one we find ourselves in today, and really start to apply this not just from a sort of nature-based or ecological standpoint, but also a human side. How do we think about this complexity of human systems also embodying heterogeneity? And I always like to zoom out a little bit because I think it's so important to remember that when I talk about heterogeneity, it isn't this thing that's an absence or an abstract. It's actually what allows this beautiful little marble to be what it is. It is our biodiversity. There is no other person on this planet that is like you or me, and it really makes us really take into account how we as landscape architects can start to embrace some of that change, some of that difference into our practice. And it led me to really thinking about how my work and practice and research are really trying to bring these two systems together. And it's really about this love for ecology, really looking at both sort of the practices that are common doctrine today, and also looking at a lot of indigenous background in terms of how land was managed over time, and bringing that together with anthropological systems, really trying to understand in a spatial context how social, cultural, linguistic systems manifest themselves onto landscapes to really bring us to this model that I'm calling landscape heterogeneity. And before I dial into some really neat projects where I start to look at this, I want to talk a little bit about some of the education I had to do prior to engaging with this work. And I think the first is understanding that there's some myths about design, particularly about the design of public space. And that is that, you know, public spaces are universal, that they're designed for all of us. And it was really important for me to dial into the history of our country, to understand who was considered property themselves, which is such a critical part of defining space and place, and how those principles manifest themselves today within our context. And, you know, we can look at this historically. We can look at how we've treated natural lands. You know, when Olmsted discovered Yellowstone and all these amazing places, you know, he was calling it nature, but these were lands that had been managed by indigenous communities for many, many years. To, you know, the way in which we look at loitering practices today, how people are being policed in terms of how they're using public space, when and in what conditions, and finally to how we see this sort of manifest into the 400 years of oppression of Black and Brown lives in the public realm. So, you know, when we talk about public space, I like to say that it's not, you know, universal. It's actually the most poignant expression of power in our country. And this has sort of created a formula. I think without understanding the differences in our society and how different communities use space, we end up with the creation of homogeneous spaces. And this is reinforced through several structural systems and institutions, everything from ADA guidelines all the way to sort of firms and institutional structures that define who and whom is supposed to create public space for their communities, to the design and education process itself, where, you know, students are brought in and stripped of every lived experience they have and re-educated under an Anglo lens, to the design and construction itself, really looking at how skate deterrents on benches and center armrests deter homeless and skateboarders. And, you know, these are spaces of exclusion, not inclusion. So that was important for me in informing this research, that it is about being able to understand that this landscape is intertwined with power dynamics in our country. And it really led me to saying, okay, so we know these issues. I've learned about this history. What can we do about it? And for me, this led me to the work I'm going to present to you today, which is really around developing landscape heterogeneity as a framework. And a lot of people like to tell me, well, what does it look like? What is it? And I'm just like, well, it's actually a state of consciousness. It's actually being intentional at every stage of the design process to make room for unlearning, for healing, for thinking about landscape beyond the terms in which we define it today, looking at how we can nourish souls, we can empower communities, we can think about manifesting pluralism in a way that really brings this back to the people that use the space. And this project that I'm going to share with you just happened at the perfect time. The Frederick Douglass Memorial Plaza was a project that occurred right when I started this research and started bringing it into practice. And this project came through our client, who was looking for a culturally competent landscape architect for the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. And it was interesting because our site, which is sort of this triangular plot over here, is a Frederick Douglass Square, and it had been dedicated as a Frederick Douglass Square in 1917 because Douglass had spoken in open air meetings in this area. And you can see here a historic photo of our site. And I think something that I always like to say is that when you start the design process, it's so important to start digging deep, because this picture is unassuming, but once you start peeling back the layers, you can see Slade's, which is just across from our site. That's the oldest Black-owned business for nightlife and food. Just adjacent to our site is a Douglass Square Pharmacy, which was an Underground Railroad station. And across the street, we have the Boston Guardian newspaper, which was the first Black-owned newspaper in Boston. So yes, it's an unassuming site, but it's steeped in history that is so important to acknowledge and bring forward into the design process. And it really led us to really rethinking how we engage. So we knew that given these histories, given the level of disinvestment in this community, it was important for us to come into the design process in a new way. So we threw away everything we knew about community engagement and actually engaged with Des Polk, who's part of the Radical Black Girl movement in Roxbury, to do a spoken word performance as our first community engagement session. And I still get chills today because it was such a formative experience. It really broke the room open. It allowed community members to feel their identities, to see themselves reflected in the space, and to ask questions that just wouldn't have come through had we started with, precedent images and sticker exercises that really weren't focused on the necessary healing that needed to happen prior to imagination. And it really was about, for me, landscape heterogeneity is also about being able to visualize these elements within the design itself. So, we got postcards like this during that session where we got so many qualitative data points about visceral experiences and their hopes for what the space could be. And we started to translate that into data visualizations that start to map those experiences, that start to map those visceral connections to place physically on sites, so that we can use that as part of our analysis process so we understand the social infrastructure that's in place. In addition to that, we also decided very intentionally to not show precedent images. We did so because this community wanted a Black landscape. They wanted something that really commemorated their legacies. And in order to do so, what we did is we were able to take those qualitative data points about what spaces felt affirmative to them within their community and created a collage, which is what you see here, that really reflects that design vernacular back to us as a design team. So all of these images here were full of inspiration, materiality, cues in terms of how spaces are being used, and really important to telling the story of this place and also to empowering the community to define design excellence on their terms. And it led us to really dialing deep. When we said, when our client asked for this landscape to be commemorative of Douglas's legacy, we wanted to do so in a way that really brought forward the diaspora in a meaningful way. So this was about really looking at how can we think about this unassuming site as having all these facets of layers, really looking at the connection to the Underground Railroad, and Douglas's legacy here, in terms of how, landscapes are such a critical way in which to navigate from the south to the north, that journey. And we wanted to bring that materiality right into our site. And I remember our client telling us during one of our sessions, she's like, Black people are gold. We are the magic, and we wanted to be able to bring that ideation, right? That visceral feeling into the materials themselves, and really looking at how we can look at exposed aggregate materials that bring in blue glass, which is really important to the African American garden, as well as those tones of earth colors, again, that harken back to some of those emotions and qualitative experiences the client group shared with us. And also this was about, being able to look at sites that have seen disinvestment with new eyes. You can certainly look at this image and see that disinvestment, but it's not devoid of beauty. These spaces actually function at a very high level from a social standpoint and are really unique areas where the community feels seen and protected. And it's important for us to take cues from what this vernacular, this design aesthetic is telling us about how space is being used. For example, the planters here on the bottom right were circular planters that were created by the community because they symbolize the warding off of evil spirits, which is a really critical piece of understanding Black and African gardens. So again, it's so important to really, what I'm saying here is I'm not trying to romanticize this investment, but what I am saying is that it's important for us as designers to look beyond, to really understand that there's actually new aesthetics that we can bring into our design that embrace what exists in place. And it really led us down a loophole of doing research. I think it's so important within the design process to make space for this. So we looked at Von Sill's Places of Spirit exhibit that she had at the Smithsonian. And really, these photographs were from her travels of the South and photographing Black and African American gardens. And it was amazing because, having grown up in the Dominican Republic myself, this felt like home. This actually felt like what I grew up seeing. This idea of mixing of materials, this sort of eclecticness, right, to space, the diversity of plant materials, which we now call ecology. These are practices that have been held by the Black and Indigenous community for a really long time, and are really important for us to bring into how we thought of both the material inspiration and the plant palette itself. And we wanted to ground that research also in what's happening in Roxbury, really looking at how freedom and Juneteenth gardens were a really critical part of building sustainability within this community. I'm sure Deborah will get into this later, but this is a community that has experienced food deserts, not having access to quality foods, and I think it was really important for us to be able to tie into this larger legacy and the movements around parks and open space within the community. And it really led us to sort of developing a plant palette that really brought together all of these things. We were using plant material that came from practices of the African American garden. We wanted every single material here to tell you a different story and also to give back. Our client themselves was asking that, they want the Black community to come to this landscape and be able to take some lavender, take some witch hazel with them, because it's part of giving back, of this sort of healing that continues within this community moving forward. And I always like to say that, it's so important to think about landscape heterogeneity, not just as happening in the engagement session, but permeating through the entire design process. So even the materials, the topography that was used, all of it is tied to the Black diaspora. There was this intentionality around being able to reflect at every stage of the process the Black identity, and to be able to sort of liberate ourselves of practices of homogeneity that usually don't reflect these identities, that don't bring these materials into play in a way that's meaningful. And it led us to sort of our final design, which is really a compilation of all of these images, really thinking about how the sculpture itself, Douglas sits in the site, is sort of complemented by the oasis that we were trying to create here, this place for belonging, this place for being seen, for the Black community to learn about the history of this place, and also to really think about how they advance moving forward, how they can think about public spaces that are designed not with them in not just to say that they're welcome, but with them in mind, that this is truly a Black landscape that reflects who they are and what it means to be Black in this community. And you'll see that this is a collage. It was done with intention. You can see the blue glows. There's so much meaning layered into this that is a really critical piece that we wanted to sort of bring into this design process. In addition to that, I want to also quickly share another project with you that's at a slightly different scale, which is Bonnet Springs Park, which is done in Lakeland, Florida. And this was a really extensive community engagement session where we did all sorts of model making, large meetings, all sorts of exercises to really get at understanding how this space could be imagined. And particularly, how do we bring the histories that were on this site and that our client was aware, but also dig a little bit deeper, understand that the efforts of the Chinese workers that built the railroad and the cultivators of the orange groves are really important in telling the story of this brownfield and how we are reimagining it for the future. And this really led us into kind of zoning in really deep, and just south of our site, we actually discovered the worker housing that supported the groves and the railroad production, and found all of this amazing material around the gardens that these workers created, really understanding this notion of substance and graciousness. And what we really wanted to do was to sort of bring this research, to bring this history into present day, and also think about how the site is evolving and serving new communities moving forward. And it really led us to sort of developing 3 goals: this idea of creating a cultural magnet for the city of Lakeland, this notion of really preserving the ecological integrity of this place, and also connecting this back to the community. And I'm not going to get into the whole site. It's a 180-acre development, but I really wanted to walk you through the garden and the botanical experience, and really show you how we wanted to take visitors on this journey of sensory experiences. First, starting with the display garden, which is really commemorating a lot of the gardening practices that came from the Chinese workers on the site. The blue garden, which again was meant to reflect the contributions of the African-American workers in this region and on the site, with this notion of the blue garden, the glass, all of these amazing elements that tell that story. And then really thinking about initiating experiences for what this community is becoming, really thinking about the growth in the Latinx and Asian community in Lakeland, and really bringing in plant material that really reflects those identities and that cultural experience. And then really walking through how we can think of this from an ecological standpoint, how the wet meadows really work together to tell this larger story of how this is a stormwater feature, but also telling us the education and history of this place in a way that's meaningful, all the way to, thinking of sound in the garden and art as really great ways of being able to, again, create more cultural meaning within those spaces. And, this takes rigor. I always like to say that landscape heterogeneity is about taking all of this down into the specifications, into the grading, into how we sort of start to manifest these spaces that become reality, and really take shape in a way that is meaningful, and adds all these layers of identity and meaning so that you have a myriad of experiences, not just one homogeneous way of experiencing the park. And I'll just end by saying that, this work, Heterogeneous Futures, is really about this much larger picture, really thinking about stardust, really thinking about who we are as a human species. We are part of this endless cycle of entropy and change and difference. And I'm really excited as a landscape architect to really start to embrace that and to inspire others to embrace difference in their landscapes and to think about those multiple identities as we start to create spaces for people of all backgrounds.
Thank you so much. Deborah, are you ready?
Yeah.
Not quite yet. There. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm going to talk about equity in neighborhood park use. So, as you know, I'm a physician, and my main focus is on health and how parks are promoting physical activity and health in general. And as you all may know, physical inactivity is a huge problem in the United States. Multiple conditions, and most, heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, cancer. And most recently, we found out it's also a risk factor for hospitalization and death from COVID-19. We found that people who are inactive have a considerably higher risk of severe consequences. What kind of physical activity are we talking about? Mostly it's the kind of activity people get in their leisure time, walking, running, playing sports. And parks are places where people can do leisure time physical activity. And in urban areas, between half and 70% of all walking distance to a park. So we do have a pretty good infrastructure of parks. They're not being utilized very well. Well, let's just ask this question first: is how much leisure time do people actually have? I mean, can they really get the recommended 20 to 30 minutes of activity a day for adults and 60 minutes for kids? This data, this bar chart, is from the American Time Use Survey, where they asked people to self-report everything they did in the past 24 hours. And so we looked at that data and figured out, well, how much time did they have to do whatever they wanted? And, you know, it wasn't care, it wasn't cooking or cleaning or self-care. And in fact, you know, everybody has way more than 30, you know, minutes a day to potentially be active. But it varies considerably between males and females and between higher and lower income. So the people with the most leisure time are low income males, that they earning below the 185% level of poverty. And then the people with the least are females that have higher incomes. So you can see it 6.5 hours for the low income males and only 5 hours for the high income females. And then if you look at these these 17 minutes, this is amount of their leisure time that's currently devoted to physical activity. And so high income males have the most time dedicated to physical activity, and males have the least amount of time devoted to physical activity. And again, this is by their self-report. And so we're looking at this physical activity. And so there was an option of they were outdoors away from home, probably in a park or green space, at home, a gym or health club or other place. And you can see who's spending time outdoors in parks. It's going to be wealthier men, and the least are low income women. It's just, you know, a fraction of the amount of time that other people are spending in activity and also outdoors. Self-report. So I've been doing a lot of research to understand how parks are used and to see whether we saw disparities in park use. So we looked at parks in high and low income cities across the country. And we called the National Study of Neighborhood Parks, representative sample of parks in cities that had a population of 100,000 or more. We focused on parks that were between 3 and 20 acres because that's a size that, you know, was enough to have a lot of different facilities for sports and other physical activity. They were not special places, but just managed by the city, and they didn't share with local schools. So they were open all the time to people. So we visited 174 parks in 2014. We did to 193 in 2016. We added Minneapolis and Portland. We hired data collectors in each of the cities to go to each park, spend 4 days in the park, counting users, documenting the features and facilities in the park, and interviewing park users and understanding the park management practices. So that we went to, we visited the park, so you have a good sampling across the country. And so how did we count people at the parks? What we did is we divided the park into what we call as target areas. And so just basically based on their function and activity, and we numbered them 1 to whatever it was. Some places we even got to almost 100 different target areas, depending on the size of the park and so on. But, you know, we'd go to target area 1, 4, and in each target area, we would count all the people by gender, by race, ethnicity, by activity level, were they sedentary, moderate, or vigorous, and of course by gender. And then what kind of activity was it? Was it a supervised or an organized activity? So we have a very rich compilation of data, and this data is actually available in the repository, so anybody can access it. And it's, you know, several times a day, several days of the week to reflect the actual use across a week of a park. And so I'm going to just share some of the major findings. So, okay, what are the most common park facilities? Lawn, you know, almost all the parks had lawns. Play areas was the second most popular. And then everything else, you know, some parks had it, some parks didn't. So a little more than half the parks had a basketball court, about half had a baseball field, only 40% had a picnic area. You can see tennis courts a third, walking paths less than 30%. So, you know, not all parks are created equal. And then the least common was the gym, only 9% of parks, only 7% had an exercise area, 5% had a dog park, 5% a skate park, and only 2% had a fitness zone. So who did we see using the park? Well, there was a huge disparity in who uses parks across the country. The disparity is by gender and by age group. So we see more males in parks, 57% overall versus 43% females in the parks. And then by age, there's a big disparity. So the most common uses of parks are children and teenagers. So children are 38% of park users, but they're only 20% of the population. Teenagers were 13%, but they're 7% of the population. Adults a little bit less, they're 44% of park users, but they're 55% of the population. And the biggest disparity was seniors. They're 18% of the population, but only 4% of park users. Now, the gender disparities, surprisingly, are worse in children and teenagers. So of all percent male, and of the teenagers, only 35% female and 65% male. So what were people doing in the park, and how did it? Well, we rarely saw females playing sports in the parks. You know, and the parks are designed for sports. So generally, I would say parks are designed more for males than they are for females, because that's who's using them most. We saw 33% of boys playing sports, only 8% of girls, 37% of male teenagers sports, only 4% of female teenagers. We never saw female adults or seniors playing sports, whereas, you know, male adults and seniors were involved in sports. So this is also cultural, but that's going on in our parks. What were children doing? Well, girls were most likely to be in the playground, whereas boys were more likely to be playing sports like baseball. They also played soccer and basketball. Only 4% of girls we saw playing baseball and 4% playing soccer. Teens. Well, girls sitting, standing, walking, those were the most popular activities. 10% in the playgrounds. By the time boys or teens, we didn't see any of them in the playgrounds. Probably the teenage girls were taking care of their younger brothers and sisters, is my guess. That's why they were there. And boys, again, basketball, baseball, soccer, they're playing sports. They're also skating, skateboarding. I don't think we ever saw girls doing that in the parks. How about adults? Women sitting, standing, walking, the picnic area, playground activities, 8%. Men sitting, standing, baseball, they're still playing sports, walking. You can see the difference in their activities. And then about seniors, again, fewer women seniors than male seniors. Women and men, they're both sitting at that age. This is their most common activity. Walking is second. We still see senior women in the playground area. We don't see any senior men in the playground area. And senior men are still playing sports, tennis, softball. Okay, so what were the factors that we showed that was associated with more people in the playgrounds? First of all, not the playgrounds, the parks as a whole. The parks are terribly underutilized. On average, we would see in an average like 8 acre, there were only 20 people per hour. So, you know, we see more people in the afternoons and on the weekends, but overall parks are, but when they get utilized more, they're larger. So for every additional acre, there's 9% more users. Population density, for an additional 10,000 people in the park, there's 13% more users. Poverty was negative. So if a park in a low-income neighborhood is used less, park in a higher income neighborhood, so that every reduction in poverty by 10% is associated with 14% more park users. Facilities, if there's more things in the park, more fields, more equipment, more facilities, for every 4 additional facilities, there are 14% more users. But the biggest thing that influenced it was the programming. So every additional supervised activity resulted in 48% more users. So a practice, a baseball game, a festival. If there was marketing, just a sign saying, come to the park for this event, 62% more users. And unfortunately, very few parks actually do a lot of marketing of their activities. So we also found that if a park had a walking path or walking loop, they had many more users, especially more seniors. So they had one in the park, 80% more users and twice as many seniors. The levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity were 90% higher if there's a walking path, because of course people are using it and then they walk, and that's moderate to vigorous physical activity. And then there was even more activity in other parts of the park as well. And they were less likely to be empty if they had a walking path. So that's a really important feature to put in parks. What about playground design and use? We're doing another study on, but our initial study showed that is one of the most popularly used places in a 5% of all the children's park use in the playgrounds. And if you ask adults, why did they come to the park? More than half of them said it was in order to bring the children. So what were the common elements? The playgrounds mainly had slides, ladders, and swings. That's like the very most common equipment. And then there was, sometimes a little bit more or less of these other things. A third had crawling tubes, maybe a third had balance elements. Fewer had shade structures, spinners, 24%, sandbox, only 13%, splash pad, 11%. And then, the playgrounds, I guess right now are actually not very, don't have a lot of features. On average, there's like, 4.5 of these different elements that maybe keep people engaged. Playgrounds were empty a lot. We talk about food deserts, but we also have play deserts where, we have these things. They're not that interesting. People don't use them that much. But what predict whether a playground is used? Well, every additional element, something extra feature in the playground was 55% more users. Balance beams, it was 65% more users. The crawling tube, 82% more. Spinners, 156% more users. And if there was a splashboard, it's more than double the numbers of users. Now, here we don't know exactly were people using these elements, or it was just a general sort of indicator of the interest of the playground. But this new study that we're doing, we're specifically going to be measuring which elements are used. Because when we did this one, we looked at the whole playground as a target area, and we didn't identify whether people were using that slide or on the bridge. But we will be doing this for this new study that we're going to be launching next month. Okay. And here are just some more playgrounds. So we also looked at differences in the park and the playground use by the income level of the neighborhood. And we really saw that they had similar elements. There wasn't that much difference between high and low income parks and playgrounds in the neighborhoods. But we did see there were more splash pads in low income neighborhoods than in higher income neighborhoods. And that was across cities, really within cities. We didn't really see that there was any sort of structural difference in the playgrounds based on the neighborhood. But we did see in the use. Like I mentioned, the park overall is used less if it's in a low-income neighborhood. The playgrounds were also used less. So for every 10 percentage points in poverty around a playground, there were 20% fewer playground users. So as I mentioned, we also surveyed adult park users. The most common park user for adults are between 26 and 39 that answer our survey. We surveyed more females than males. We were just randomly asking people in the area in the park to answer our surveys. And whether a low-income area park, they had a similar duration of stay. They reported a similar frequency of visits, they actually had perceived the quality and the conditions of the parks to be pretty similar. The biggest difference was the perception of safety. And so that 20% of the park users in a high poverty neighborhood thought the park was unsafe versus only 5% in a low poverty neighborhood. So I think this perception of safety probably explains the majority of the reason why we see fewer users in the high poverty area parks.
Cohen, you have about a minute.
Okay, so anyway, people are willing to pay for more. Right now we invest about $95 a person in for parks. We spend over $11,000 per person for care. And you know, I think one of the things we need to do is to do more to understand, you know, these issues with leisure time, and to realize that our social activities do more to bring people into parks. There's a lot of things we could do on social media. I had an example of Westminster, Colorado, where the Parks Department had created this myth about a monster in their lake that came out and laid eggs around the lake, and they planted eggs in the different parks, and they got families to come and go hiking and searching for these eggs and rainbow poo that the monsters laid. And so, you know, these things that we create are really, I think, the future of trying to get people into parks to use them. And also, again, more features, guiding them to meet the needs of females and seniors that are underserved currently by our. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Deborah. That was fabulous. So let's go back to gallery view. Deborah, if you can take off your screen share. There we go. So I've got a couple of questions here that some folks have posted into the Q&A. The first one actually is, let me stick with Dr. Cohen's presentation for just a second. Dr. Cohen, did your study that you were reporting to us include any kind of data collection around race? And also, if so, were there any trends associated with income levels within race itself?
So we did collect race, and what we found out was that basically the race of the people in the parks reflected the race in the neighborhood. So, you know, there were differences, but it's something that we actually haven't analyzed very closely, but it did appear that it's just a reflection of the people in the neighborhood.
Let's see. Right. And then I was also interested in any data collection around biking. We noticed that a couple of people noted in the chat that it seemed astounding that there weren't more people biking. Like, that seems like a really super popular thing to do in a park around here.
Yeah, so these are small parks. You know, they were, again, between 3 and 20 acres, and most of them don't have bike paths in the park. I mean, only 29% had walking paths. So you have to, there's so many different types of parks. We only focused on the 3 to 20 acres, and I don't know if any of them had bike paths. I don't think they did.
True, true. Did you find that people were biking to the parks, or their bike racks and things like that, or did you?
Yeah, so we did ask, how did people get to the park? I don't have that answer with me right now, but it's a small percentage, you know, less than 5%. About half the people drive and half the people walk, and then, you know, whatever small percent are biking or taking public transport.
Right, right. Okay. I'd like to go ahead and open up the floor. So is there anybody who has any additional questions for either of our speakers? Okay, yep. Let's see. So we do have a question. Did the Boston project, Diana, research ever raise the question of passive versus active elements in the park spaces? Olmsted was a passive guy.
Yeah, that's a great question. We did a little bit of both, to be honest. The perspective image that I showed you at the end is the one part of the site, and then there's another plaza behind that sort of interacts. So we were thinking both about how the plaza could be a passive space to reflect, but also during larger community events like a Juneteenth celebration, that plaza can be activated to sort of transform that space. So there was a sense of flexibility and diversity of use across the year, depending on, you know, whether you're just walking through, getting from point A to point B, or there for an actual celebration.
Absolutely. One of the things that I noticed that I thought was astounding about your presentation, Diana, was the focus on a traditional plant material, the the plant material that is of tradition. And there's a lot of Southern traditional plants like that I think that it can even be broken down between where a person comes from. You know, there's a big tradition here with things like camellias and crepe myrtles, but I loved seeing some of the other traditional plants like forsythia. And I know that there was a book written several years ago by one of my professors about the tradition of painting the trunks of trees white at the bottom, and then also sweeping the landscape, like sweeping it to be very hard packed. And I wondered if you encountered any of that along the way.
That's actually really amazing, because when we were doing research for Bonnet Springs Park, we actually found that within how the workers in the area were talking about gardening practices. And it was interesting because those practices of sweeping your garden, especially in a circular motion, relate back to the African garden. There's so many parallels, right, between that understanding. And I think what was interesting for us is that often when we talk about like diversity and inclusion and all of these things, it's like those are heady terms we all agree on. But what I'm trying to show people with my work is that there's ways in which that can be spatialized, that it's something physical and visceral in terms of the experiences we create. And I really love Richard Sennett's work, and I highly recommend it. He talks so much about the public realm being the space where we witness our differences, because that helps us build empathy for the other, right? Which predisposes us to democracy. So I think it's so important for us, you know, with my work, I'm not just talking about Black and brown landscapes. I'm talking about being able to create a diversity of landscapes and experiences so that we can see how the other is using space and place and build empathy for them, right? And work towards a better society, because power and land, they're all tied together. And it's really important for us to think about dismantling those systems at the site level. And it can be happen with materials and specifications and all the things that we do as designers.
Absolutely. There's one more question I think we have time for, and I actually thought this was really interesting too. And Dr. Cohen, you brought up the concern and the importance of safety in especially lower income neighborhoods, and we have found that to be the case as well. And one of the things that one of the viewers is questioning is, what materials do you see being used for surfacing of fields and playgrounds? We hear more and more complaints about the heat and abrasion of plastic or synthetic turf fields and rubberized playgrounds. And we hear that too. And I've actually been to places where you can, in the heat of an Atlanta summer, that rubberized surface is boiling hot and actually will melt things into it. But it's also perceived as being a safer surface because things like needles or other kinds of sharp objects wouldn't get buried underneath like a mulch layer. I don't know if that was a part of either one of your areas of research that's kind of very detailed. But
yeah, so the safety I was talking about was mainly fear of crime, and violence. So that was the main concern of the people in the low-income neighborhoods. But as far as the surfaces, I know there's constantly change about what's considered better or safer, and it also varies on where you are in the country. Sand has not been considered that safe, but it's one of the surfaces that kids love to play in. And, you get more kids, in having fun in that. So I think there's always a, give and take and plus and minus with all these things. So we just need a little more research. So that's what a researcher always says.
Absolutely. Well, we hope that that we'll be able to see your research as it reaches its completion. I know things are still in the works. And have you found have you found any evidence that the park use has been changing after COVID, during COVID? I mean, we're still sort of in the middle.
Well, playgrounds were closed. Parks were closed at the beginning of the pandemic. So yeah, absolutely. But I think, that remains to be seen. We have some data pre-COVID, so we can do some more counts afterwards. You certainly have a comparison so that we can see what the direction is.
Right.
But, when we actually compared 2014 to 2016, the use of parks was going down. I mean, there was a downward trend. And I think that's all related to the upward trend of social media and electronic, entertainment, which continues to grow. And who knows how long that will continue to grow and whether people will finally realize, like, that's not, going to keep them healthy. So we'll have to see how long that downward trend that already was happening before COVID will continue.
We might have time for a couple more questions. How should friends groups incorporate all of this wonderful information into design for updating an existing park? Is there any, will there be a report issue? Will some of the information be available? Are you considering a new book or articles and things like that?
Is that for me? Well, I mean, I think, like I was saying, I think a lot of the programming is what's important in getting people to parks. And we just need more experiments and trying new stuff and creating stories and making it part of more cultural. Most of the funding for parks has just been for bricks and mortar and just the capital improvements. But really what makes the most is having people and programs and stories and events. And we have not invested in that as a society. And I think that's where things need to go, and also to make those spaces more conducive for people to spend time with each other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both of you. I found both of your talks super inspiring, and I think that our viewers did as well. I'd love to see not only just some cultural instances of plant material brought back into to some of the park's designs, but also some of maybe the play space, games and things that other cultures bring to the United States and to different parts of the country. I think would be really super interesting to integrate into our parks. So with that, we're going to close the session, everyone. And I invite you all to take a quick break. We're going to be meeting back on the main stage at 2 actually we'll be from about 2 to 2:15. It looks like we've got a short break you can take. And then you can also visit the networking area, the expo area too, if you would like. And we'll be back on the main stage at 2:15 to hear our final speaker, Atia Wells, who will be joining us then. And I think you'll all really enjoy that too. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Diana and Deborah, for joining us today.
Thank you, Terry.